Racing's pretty much in my family's blood. Grandfather, he raced locally here at Southside Speedway, and my dad also, he raced locally around different racetracks.
We've always been involved in it. My husband used to own some cars way before it was cool. Way before that.
Southside Speedway is where I got my start, so of course I have a couple memorable wrecks, and one of those was a go-kart wreck where a couple cars got together and I ended up flipping about 10 times down this front straightaway here. I would say I'm addicted to going fast, running 200 miles per hour. It doesn't get any more exciting than that. I race motorcycles at local drag strips and stuff when I'm home, and it's a lot of fun. It's pretty much just an adrenaline rush, and that's pretty much what I look for all the time. I haven't figured out why I like speed so much. The faster we're going, the happier I am. It's a good time.
Let me ask you a question. Has something ever happened to someone that completely changed how you feel about a particular subject? Maybe even multiple subjects? Even if you didn't know that person at all on a personal level, let alone even met the person? This is a video I have planned for and worked on since September 2018. 8 months. That's how much this story has affected me, and at times has gotten stuck in my head off and on for the last 10 years. I know what some of you are going to ask me. Why? Well, the honest answer to that question is, I don't know why. There are multiple things that come to my mind when I try to answer that question. Is it because of a similar story about one of my favorite game show hosts? Is it because the racer in question is technically one of the two closest to a hometown racer in relativity to my home area for nearly my entire life? Is it because in his last race, the contact from that now infamous crash actually came from one of my guys? Is it because most of us didn't know the truth about a major event that happened in his life that more than likely was a major factor to what happened to him? Is it because I actually know where the place he died at is, and every time I pass by that place while traveling, I think of him? Is it because of an unknowing desire to know the truth so this doesn't happen again, ever, to anyone? Is it because I wish NASCAR would actually do something about it so they can help other former drivers and crew members going through what they were trying to ignore in terms of this racer years ago? Is it because I wish NASCAR would actually make things right with his family after what they did to make things worse for this racer? Is it because I feared it would happen again to someone else while the tragic news was still fresh? Is it because I fear that it still could happen to other former drivers based on their injury and mental health history, even if I no longer have this fear regarding the original driver this fear came about over? Is it because I for some reason feel partially responsible, though I know I'm not, and believe me, I'll explain that. Well, maybe it's all that and then some. The racer's name is Kevin Grubb. For pretty much his entire NASCAR career, he was a Busch Series, now Xfinity Series, regular. He was in NASCAR for the better part of a decade, but along with the likes of Leroy Yarborough and Jerry Nadeau, his story is also among the saddest in NASCAR history. Admittedly, his story is not the first time I've heard of a racer I know of dying by suicide, and unfortunately it isn't the most recent either. But his is the one that has deeply affected me the most. The one that has essentially changed me in terms of a lot of things, as I will explain throughout this video. This is Kevin Grubb, 10 years later. Kevin Grubb and his older brother Wayne are both from Mechanicsville, Virginia. To put this in perspective, compared to all of the other NASCAR racers I know and I have seen race over the years that are also from the state of Virginia, which is also my home state, Mechanicsville, which is not too far at all from the Richmond Raceway, is the closest hometown for any NASCAR racer past or present to my home area of many years. Most of my life, as a matter of fact. So essentially, the Grubb brothers were technically the closest to a hometown racer I ever had. The Grubb family is also known for two things in that area: racing, and a crane rental/construction business, which is actually one of the biggest in the nation. In terms of racing, Kevin and Wayne raced together in the local divisions, especially in late models. eventually making their debut together in the National Touring Series of NASCAR at the 1996 Fast Smart Truck Shootout at Richmond. Both drivers competed off and on throughout mainly the late 90s in the Busch Series, with Kevin almost getting a win at Dover in the 1998 MBNA Gold 200 Busch race over Matt Kenseth. He ended up getting 5 top 10s that year, 2 of those being top 5s, including that near win at Dover, which he also got his only pole win. 1999 is where things start to look up, as Kevin joined Bruco Motorsports alongside Casey Atwood, who would become one of his closest friends. He would stay there for 3 seasons, getting 6 top 5s and 18 top 10s. Originally, despite rumors that he was going to be released in the middle of 2001, Kevin believed that he and his team would be able to work out a deal for him to return for the 2002 season. But that didn't come to pass. Grubb was eventually replaced by veteran driver Jeff Purvis. Starting at the 3rd race of the 2002 season, Grubb was hired by Team Bristol Motorsports and competed in most of the races that season, replacing Kelly Dedden, ending up with 2 top 5s and 6 top 10s. Kevin also tried to make his Cup Series debut at the 2002 Pontiac Excitement 400, but wasn't fast enough to get into the field on the first lap and then spun out on the second. There were plans that Kevin and Team Bristol would try to make more Cup attempts, but for some reason those plans never came to fruition. Kevin also believed that he would be staying with Team Bristol for the 2003 season. See, the original plan was for Kevin to go to the Cup Series in 2003 with that team. Meanwhile, Deborah Renshaw would be taking over his Busch ride. However, after a bad wreck during an ARCA practice session at Charlotte resulting in Deborah being injured, and that wasn't even the worst part of that wreck, and no, I wish not to discuss it, all of those plans fell apart. In addition to Deborah's injuries ruining the Busch Series part of the 2003 plans, for whatever reason, Kevin and Team Bristol couldn't agree to a contract and split at the end of the 2002 season. The interesting part is that Team Bristol Motorsports ended up hiring Hermie Sadler for the 2003 season, but only ran the first 10 races of the season, and then quietly shut down. As for Kevin, he ended up at Carroll Racing for all but one of his starts for the 2003 season. Unfortunately, he had his worst year yet, getting only 2 top 10s and 23 starts for that team, with the other 11 races that year going to either Chad Blunt or Lance Norrick. In addition, that team also folded at the end of the year. Now 2004 is where everything starts to change. The original plan was for Kevin to compete in 10 races in the number 35 car for Team Renzi, which at that time was a high-level team in the Busch Series, alongside Bobby Hamilton Jr., who had run the full year in the number 25. But during the spring Rockingham weekend, which Kevin was at as a spectator, NASCAR had him take a drug test, which he actually ended up failing. Due to this, he was suspended indefinitely, and said suspension was announced during the Vegas weekend in March.
All right, Jeff, this week NASCAR announcing the indefinite suspension of 25-year-old driver Kevin Grubb for violation of the substance abuse policy. Grubb will remain suspended until he meets NASCAR's terms and conditions, including counseling and periodic random testing. NASCAR President Mike Helton said that there is a moral responsibility to protect the integrity of the sport. Some heard this news, and although the situations aren't identical, they say, hey, well, Scott Wimmer, he didn't receive any kind of punishment.
Well, I mean, things are kind of like up in the air as far as Scott Wimmer is concerned, but they're 2 separate issues, at least at this point. And you need to kind of point out the fact that NASCAR doesn't do any kind of random testing. They do what they call reasonable suspicion testing, and what that means is if they believe something's going on, they need to do a test to do 2 things. Number one, either to clear that person's name or to get that person some help. So that's what NASCAR is all about, is to keep the sport as safe and as clean as possible.
All right, reasonable suspicion, no random testing. All right, thanks.
Do you know how stupid Jeff Hammond sounded right now in that video? Ugh. Now, I have seen what most people who know this story say they know what drug that Kevin was suspended for, but my thing is it was never confirmed by any true source. The only drivers I'm aware of that have said what they were suspended for are Tim Richmond, Shane Neal, Aaron Fike, A.J. Allmendinger, and depending on whose story you believe, Jeremy Mayfield. The only drug I've ever seen confirmed Kevin ever being on was actually antibiotics. See, Kevin dealt with the aching pair of wisdom teeth along with the flu all at once after the 2002 MBNA All-American Heroes 200, a race where he got spun by Greg Biffle and then his car was ran into hard by Tim Fedewa. He ended up missing the Kansas and Fall Charlotte races as a result after getting dizzy during a practice session for the Kansas race while dealing with all of that. Many had wondered if Kevin actually suffered a concussion in that wreck as well, and while he denied it, also keep in mind that was the exact same weekend in which the first junior bomb regarding concussions was announced. Even though both a CT scan and MRI Kevin had in early October 2002 came back negative. I also wonder if there were any lingering pains regarding any of that afterwards, or other things that you'll find out later. Interestingly enough, I unwittingly stumbled across some interesting information during a video binge concerning a huge topic from 2018. I'll let you guess which one. I saw something that caught my attention, and I found the info as, weird. Regardless, with this info, something crossed my mind. Antibiotics, for the most part, does not help with the flu. So it was most certainly for the wisdom teeth. But antibiotics also doesn't relieve pain. So I wondered if Kevin was prescribed and was on oxycodone or oxycontin after the pain regarding the wisdom teeth and assumingly something else for the flu, and no one else knew. I know it may sound speculatory to you guys, but then again, so does all of the people on these forums who say that Kevin was on, well, that. And yes, people being prescribed oxycodone or oxycontin for wisdom teeth is a thing, so to me it's plausible. It also wouldn't be the first time something like this had happened within NASCAR or auto racing itself either. Tim Steele had a bad crash years ago, suffered a brain injury, was prescribed oxycontin to treat his pain from that, and ended up having a problem from it. He did manage to beat his problem, though. I'm not exactly positive in what all of these forums have said and believe what they said was the actual case. For some reason, I'm now more inclined to believe that Kevin may have had an ongoing pain regarding that week in 2002, and was kept being given prescription oxycodone or oxycontin for those pains, and eventually got addicted to that, thus explaining why his 2003 season was so bad compared to past seasons, and would also explain everything regarding the 2004 suspension and the assumptions and speculations that Kevin failed the drug test for that. Probably because my original assumption by most fans is more crazy than what my mind put together in terms of these puzzle pieces, so to speak. Yeah, I get it if this theorem was actually wrong and the massive speculation amongst the forums actually turned out to be right, due to the likely scenario of Kevin self-medicating to try and heal himself from physical, mental, or emotional pain regarding the last few years up to that point. I guess I felt so distraught and heartbroken over this story for so long that I'm looking for something, anything, to make this story feel less tragic. Then again, is it possible to have a story like this end up being less tragic, even when the most tragic of outcomes would still happen anyway? I'm not sure of the truth on that first suspension, but knowing NASCAR, especially now, it wouldn't surprise me one bit if it turns out this was the truth regarding that first suspension, and we had unintentionally, and unfortunately, made out Kevin to be a druggie. Besides, it wouldn't be the only time that a health concern involving Kevin Grubb was initially massively underreported. Regardless of what the truth of that 2004 suspension was, Kevin admitted that he needed to take care of himself, saying, "I've got to get some counseling and get myself straight before worrying about anything else." Now, that was said in March, and either variation of the story could line up with what he said perfectly. However, sometime in either September or October later that year, a post was made to the forum of his website saying, "Kevin needs our help now. He's no better, in fact probably worse than in February. He looks terrible and is basically a dead man walking. I'm afraid he will not be here much longer if the fans don't come together and save him from himself. Most of his friends and family have given up. We cannot allow this young man to self-destruct. Well, he didn't self-destruct, and Kevin did eventually get reinstated and beat whatever drug issue was bothering him, regardless of what it was. He made his return in June of 2006, his return race being at the 2006 Federated Auto Parts 300 at Nashville. In 2006, between the Truck Series and Busch Series, Kevin only made 9 starts, 4 of those being in the Truck Series for Billy Ballou, with his best finish being a 14th place finish at Memphis. His last truck start was at Nashville, which has interesting memories, for me at least. But unfortunately, the same can't be said for Kevin's very last NASCAR start. Kevin's last race was the 2006 Emerson Radio 250 at Richmond. After a couple cars checked up in front of him for whatever reason, his car was hit by Kenny Wallace, resulting in Kevin crashing and falling out of the race at the end of lap 1. That, unfortunately, though, is not the end of this part of the story. After the Richmond weekend, NASCAR announced that Kevin was suspended indefinitely again for violating the substance abuse policy. Now, that is what most people had heard in terms of the news. Most people heard that and thought that was the end of that. But only a few at that time found out the truth behind what NASCAR had actually suspended him for. The truth was that Kevin was supposedly suspended for refusing to submit to a random drug test right after that lap 1 crash. However, the story gets more interesting when it's revealed that NASCAR attempted to get Kevin to submit to said drug test while Kevin was suffering from a concussion. A concussion NASCAR nor the medics of the Infield Care Center ever attempted to diagnose. Kevin said, "I don't remember most of being at the track. I had people pulling me in 20 different directions. I ended up leaving from what I understand." Within the next couple days after the race, Kevin wasn't feeling well and went to a hospital, unable to remember most of the events of that race weekend, let alone what day it was. That was when he found out about the concussion and was diagnosed with it. Sometime after that, Kevin found out about the suspension due to the refusal he doesn't even remember doing. And he offered to NASCAR to take the test immediately after trying to explain to NASCAR about the concussion. NASCAR itself refused the test, and instead recommended Kevin to talk with Dr. David Black, the Aegis Labs doctor that at that time was the head of NASCAR's drug testing and road recovery program, which apparently he never heard from even after repeated attempts to contact him. Kevin was hopeful that something would get worked out after everything that had happened that week, but it never did. Over the next 2.5 years, the only known things that happened with Kevin is that he went back to working for his dad's crane business, and then in December of 2007, he got married. That's all we really know. While some believe that he did try to come back to NASCAR, it is unknown if this was actually true, since in terms of the racing community, nothing was heard of at all officially concerning Kevin since that 2006 Richmond debacle. That was until May 6th, 2009. For reasons that more than likely we'll never know whatsoever, Kevin checked into the Alpine Motel off Route 1 on May 5th. By himself. He was supposed to have checked out the next day on the 6th at 11 a.m., but he didn't. The motel's manager used an emergency key to get into his room to check in on him, and discovered his body in a bed with blood on the walls and the ceiling. While news of Kevin's death started being reported late at night on the 6th, most of us found out about Kevin's death the next day on the 7th. And that started a chaotic and disastrous weekend, let alone month, for NASCAR itself. When it was initially revealed that Kevin was gone without knowing as to how, there was an automatic assumption among some people as to what had happened. But those assumptions were badly wrong. When the truth was revealed as to what happened, there was shock, despair, sadness, pain, and sorrow. On May 7th, it was revealed that Kevin's death was caused by a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. In simpler but more real terms, he died by suicide. When the reports of Kevin's death started to be updated by multiple sources in their own way regarding as to how, whether it be the forums, the bloggers, the major news sites, or high-level racing reporters with their own variant of the story or their memories of Kevin, this is when a lot of us started being notified of the truth behind what really happened in 2006 at Richmond. From what I've gathered, only 2 sources truly covered what had happened in its entirety when that second suspension happened: Dave Moody's blog and the Front Stretch website. Meanwhile, a lot of people just wanted to know why. Why did this happen? What contributed to all this? Of course, a lot of people wondered if drug use had anything to do with this, whether he never truly beat whatever problem drug-wise that he had, or if he was in such despair over what NASCAR did to him in 2006 at Richmond that NASCAR unknowingly and unwittingly reversed those efforts that Kevin put in to try and fix whatever problems that he had in the early 2000s. Or maybe even made any other current problems at that time even worse. Well, there was a toxicology test done on his blood that would have taken 6 weeks to complete. However, to the best of my knowledge, those results were never released to the public. Based on similar stories I have seen over the years, that usually means one of 2 things. Either Kevin's family requested to keep the results private, or any and all tests came back negative, meaning there were no drugs in Kevin's system whatsoever at the time of his death, and thus there was no reason to release the report because there was no news. And interestingly enough, the latter of those explanations is usually the most likely reason for that to happen. Even though I'm not positive, or maybe not willing to believe, in what the people on the internet said about that first suspension in 2004 and the circumstances behind that, the much bigger, massive consensus among the racing community was clear after Kevin's death in terms of what happened. It was even more clear amongst those who claimed they knew Kevin at a personal level, or at the very least have met him. And after doing these kind of searches relating to different subjects, it's fairly obvious now within retrospect that the problem that Kevin was battling for so long was not drug abuse, but depression. That takes me back to 2007, to when I did searches on my favorite game show host and stumbled across the entire story of the last 2 years of the life of Ray Combs. After being unfairly dished from Family Feud in 1994, Ray had gotten into a car wreck, which left him in pain for the rest of his life. He also had a couple comedy clubs close on him. He hosted a show that essentially fused Family Feud and Double Dare together, which didn't last long at all, called Family Challenge. He ended up in massive debt. And worst of all, he and his wife Debbie were going through a separation that looked to have their marriage end in divorce. All of this had a major impact on Ray from a mental standpoint, to the point he nearly overdosed on Valium in what was believed to be a suicide attempt at an apartment he had rented. And only after calling his wife during the said episode was he taken to a hospital then. The next week, Ray appeared at his house, hitting his head against the outside of the house. With the police thinking he was becoming suicidal, Ray was put into a mental institution on a 72-hour suicide watch, and he still died by suicide. I guess because I basically learned everything possible about the circumstances that led to Ray's battle with depression and his subsequent death, I wanted to know those same answers regarding Kevin Grubb. When did Kevin's battle with depression start and why? And what other things happened that made it worse besides what happened in 2006 at Richmond? It may be just me and these searches I've done over the years, but I think I found the answers to those questions, at least on the racing side of it. Earlier, I referenced Casey Atwood, Kevin's first teammate at Bruco Motorsports, who would become one of Kevin's closest friends. Well, Kevin has said he has a bunch of close friends in racing. In the 2 BGN Racing fan chats I found involving Kevin, his list of friends included Bobby Hamilton Jr., Jamie McMurray, Shane Meal, Ricky Hendrick, Casey Atwood, Hank Parker Jr., and less specifically all of the younger guys, the guys essentially around his age. The 2 fan chats were in September 2001 and July of 2002. But based on a special picture I found that also included Casey Atwood and Hank Parker Jr., I know one more driver who was a close friend of Kevin's. Adam Petty. I can only imagine that a lot, if not most drivers, was a friend of Adam Petty's back in the 90s in that fateful year of 2000. Like Kevin Grubb's death starting a disastrous month for NASCAR in May of 2009, let alone a disastrous month and a half. Adam Petty's death from a Busch Series practice crash at New Hampshire of May of 2000 started a disastrous year, let alone a disastrous year and a half, for NASCAR, and by extension, ARCA too. Everyone was affected by Adam's death. I can only imagine that his close friends were affected more than most. And looking back on everything, among Adam's friends, it more than likely affected Kevin the hardest. That tragedy to me is essentially the catalyst as to what started Kevin Grubb's depression, and over time, his long fight against it. Just because I believe that's what started it, does not mean I believe it's the only reason. One of my favorite phrases to use is, there's more than one reason for everything. And because of the span of time between what happened to Adam and where Kevin's story starts to turn tragic, I think there was more to Kevin's depression. There are other things around that time that could have been factors. The fact his older brother Wayne basically retired from driving in NASCAR after the 2000 season and wasn't around the track for a long while definitely crossed my mind. But I think there's 3 other things that might have done it more than anything else. One of them to me was the fact that every time Kevin started getting momentum in relation to his current ride at that time and positively believed he'd be back the next season, something would always happen to where it didn't work out. It feels like your efforts are not enough, or things happen that absolutely ruin your plans. With Kevin, this happened for 3 straight years. In 2001, there were rumors he would be ditched from Bruco Motorsports mid-season. But he wasn't, and he had hoped to return. At the end of the year, though, he was ditched in favor of veteran racer Jeff Purvis. Then he was hired after the second race of the 2002 season by Team Bristol Motorsports, where in addition to most of the remaining Busch races, he tried to make one Cup start at Richmond, but wasn't able to get in. He had planned to go to the Cup Series full-time in 2003 with that team. But after his original Busch ride replacement, Deb Renshaw, got injured, the plans basically fell through, leaving Kevin out of a ride again. Ironically, the team didn't last long afterward. Only 10 Busch races. Kevin then went to Carroll Racing for 2003 and had his worst season yet. At the end of the year, that team shut down. That's 3 straight years of bouncing around to rides that got worse and worse equipment-wise. And this is not like one of those driver rental rides where scenarios have a driver going to a new ride the following season, but not next season, so they go to another ride, needing a driver for 1 year to fill the time. This is hope for the future being dashed 3 straight years. It's not hard to imagine that kind of situation where you have so much hope for your plans and your future, just for them to be dashed each and every time. And you feel bad and so desperate for something, anything, good to happen. Another thing that could have been, and looking back on it probably was, a factor to me, was what happened between the Fall Dover event and Kansas weekend in 2002, where Kevin tried to tough out dealing with wisdom teeth pain and the flu all at once. But after scrubbing the wall during practice at Kansas and expressing how he was feeling physically, He eventually had to sit out 2 races after the infield care center medics wouldn't even clear him to even start at Kansas. I still wonder if there was any other medication that Kevin had besides the antibiotics mentioned in the article from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Antibiotics can help you with the wisdom teeth, but not the flu. My best guess would be that he would have gotten something else for that too, let alone the pain from the wisdom teeth that the antibiotics wouldn't be able to fix. Before 2006, the main thing in my mind that I think worsened Kevin's depression more than anything was that he never truly got to achieve his dream of being in the Cup Series, let alone get a win in the Busch Series. He only had 1 Cup attempt at the 2002 Pontiac Excitement 400, which resulted in a DNQ. In addition, his best race finish in the Busch Series was 2nd at Dover in 1998. Darn you, Matt Kenseth! A sense of failure can lead to emotional pain, which leads to even more depression, which can lead to self-medicating of any sort, which more than likely was what led to what happened in 2004, regardless of what the truth regarding that first suspension actually was. What is most haunting regarding that suspension in 2004 was a quote from Kevin himself that was said in a 2006 article on NASCAR's own website. When he said in reaction to his own suspension, "Unbelievable. I just couldn't believe it. When they said I failed a drug test and I was suspended indefinitely, honestly it felt like my life was coming to an end." Now tell me your heart isn't wrenching right now as you read those words. I bet you're lying. For a while, things seem to have gotten to the point where the tragic outcome we all know of would have actually happened sooner. His website in the last quarter of 2004 asked for messages of support for Kevin because of his mood and depression getting real bad. So bad to the point where it was feared he would have been lost at that point in time. I know at the time many assumed it was because of drug use, but considering the time of said post to the best of what I could find, I wonder if his depression was amplified at that point by losing another close friend. Don't forget, another one of Kevin's closest friends was Ricky Hendrick, who died in a plane crash on October 24th, 2004, and in Virginia nonetheless. Dealing with all that Kevin was dealing with at that point, in that amount of time, and then that happens, I just know that can lower a person's mood. Plane crashes have always sucked, and have always deeply affected people. Heck, it took me nearly over a year to get over the death of my all-time favorite game show host, Peter Tamarkin, after he died in a plane crash in 2006. I don't want to imagine the pain that anyone would go through by losing someone they had a personal connection to through a plane crash. Between March of 2004 and June of 2006, despite whatever massive bout he went through near the end of 2004, Kevin spent a lot of time just trying to heal himself from the drug portion of his depression, and perhaps his depression too by effect, which it appeared he ended up successful, at least with the drug use part of it. That is mainly what he had to focus on in order to make a return to NASCAR. When Kevin did make his return to NASCAR in June of 2006, he talked about what he did for those 2+ years, saying, "Things are a lot different when you're not racing. You do a lot of soul searching. For a good long while, I've been working on myself really hard and getting my life back together. I didn't even work that hard to get back into racing. That's all I've done for so long. Things have changed a lot since then." He had similar thoughts when he was interviewed by the site that used to be Seen Daily. "The thought about coming back wasn't even in my head until I knew I was ready to come back. I went through a lot before I made that decision. I wanted to make sure I was right before I took that second chance." However, racing-wise, the last thing that could have worsened Kevin's depression, and in retrospect undoubtedly did the most damage in more ways than one, more than anything had to be that ridiculous deal NASCAR did to him at Richmond in 2006. Just put yourself in this scenario and think about it this way. You're a young race car driver trying to make a comeback after being out of the car for over 2 years. You're making a start at your home track. You're just coming off a top 10 result at a track that's not your style of racetrack, and in one of the lower level rides of the series. And the race before, you led laps. Then after the first lap of your home race, you got crashed after contact from another car. The angle of the hit gave you a concussion. Meanwhile, the sanctioning body tries to have you submit to a drug test, not caring at all about the concussion you just suffered. They claim you refused said test and suspended you indefinitely as a result. You informed the sanctioning body of the concussion and offered to take the test immediately to make things right on both sides. But they are the ones who refused the test. And essentially that ends your racing career and hopes and dreams. How sad, hurt, and upset would that make you? You can only imagine how it would affect someone who was battling depression, let alone had just suffered a concussion. Which, by the way, is not a good combination. In fact, the more concussions you have had, the worse the connection between those concussions and depression can be against someone. The worst part is, that 2006 incident at Richmond isn't the only time Kevin suffered a concussion after a wreck. There was a crash in the 1998 CarQuest Auto Parts 250 at Gateway where Kevin hit hard driver's side first. The crash kind of reminds me of Andy Houston's crash in the 2001 Brickyard 400, where the crashes look the same, especially if you notice the similarities in damage. In addition, the way he looked when he exited the car reminded me of Johnny Benson after he was injured during the 2002 Pepsi 400 at Daytona. While the report on Kevin during the race after the crash said he had his bell rung and was woozy when he was taken to the infield care center, what is not said afterwards is that Kevin was actually taken to a hospital and was diagnosed with a concussion because of that wreck. This revealed by Kevin himself during a 2003 interview. This made me wonder, though, how many concussions and other head injuries did Kevin suffer in his short life? Don't forget, before and during his era, drivers didn't really keep up with that kind of information, and most drivers from that generation and before wouldn't be able to tell you how many concussions they've had during their careers. This is at least 2 I have found on Kevin, and I didn't even know about the concussion at Gateway in 1998 until the very end of April 2019. Who knows how many concussions Kevin, let alone other drivers from the mid-2000s and before, have actually had. To be honest, part of me also wonders if Kevin had CTE as a result of his concussions. Football players younger than him that have died have been found to have CTE. So it wouldn't surprise me if Kevin did suffer from CTE as a result of his at least 2 concussions. And that amplified his depression and pain he was suffering from as a result in the long run, along with all of the other factors. Until the very end. We'll never know if there was anything outside of NASCAR and what they've done that contributed to Grubb's depression battle. Despite living in Virginia for nearly my whole life, there was no way I was going to try and find any of Kevin's family or friends to personally ask them about it. That wouldn't be right. I wouldn't doubt it, though, if there was a sense of failure or disappointment that he had felt concerning his friends and family that would have been in play, even with the support system he said he had in 2006. The only things we know about Grubb from a personal standpoint is that anytime he wasn't involved in racing, he was working with the family business, W.O. Grubb, and that he was married in December of 2007. So it was certain he was still trying to find happiness. Unfortunately, when you're fighting depression, that happiness is a huge struggle to find and keep. And you're constantly battling the sadness that has deeply affected you on a physical, mental, emotional, and personal level. In local articles after his death, you can also tell. The quote among those articles that caught my attention the most came from Southside Speedway racer Brandon Hendrick, who, according to one of the articles, last talked with Grubb in December 2008. He said that Kevin appeared to have adjusted to life without racing. But he also said, "I didn't want to bring up racing because I knew it bothered him, so he just steered clear of it. I'm not sure if he put racing behind him." When you do these searches looking for clues to what happened to Kevin to cause all of this via the internet, you see the usual responses, both the good and the bad. But when I see the bad, like, "Oh, he was a druggie, good riddance," or "would have had a great career if not for drugs," I can't help but think back to all the bad things my friends and I have said about drivers like Grubb in the past. See, it all started in the fall of 2003 when Shane Meal first got suspended. The news was found out from the Fall Dover Cup Series pre-race show, when Bill Weber said,
Also this week, NASCAR suspended Busch Series driver Shane Meal indefinitely for violating its substance abuse policy. That suspension remains in effect until Meal meets the terms and conditions set forth by NASCAR. That includes counseling and random testing.
My friends and I were watching this, and we were 12 years old and younger at that point. We didn't know what substance abuse meant. We never even heard of that term before. It took us 5 seconds to learn what it meant in layman's terms, because my mom was also in the living room getting ready to go somewhere, and upon hearing that, her response was, "Ooh." I turned to her and asked, "What does that mean?" And she simply responded with, "Drugs." Now think back to the days as a kid when you're taught that drugs are bad, medications are good, and there is a difference between the two. We had a lot of interesting yet sometimes dumb rules regarding our racing group, but this one in hindsight was the worst. It was called the Drug Boy Rule. Essentially, it was named after Shane Meal's nickname we have given to him in response to this, and the rule was simple. If you're suspended for drugs, you're automatically a bad guy. And Kevin Grubb was caught in the crossfire of this in March of 2004. Coupled with Meal's second suspension in 2005 and then lifetime ban in 2006, then followed by Grubb's second suspension later in 2006, it made things worse. I specifically remember finding out about Grubb's second suspension during the pre-race show for the 2006 New Hampshire 200 truck race that next weekend. Once again, all we heard was that he violated the substance abuse policy. Absolutely nothing else regarding the concussion or any of that. I recall my response being, "Ha!" in an angry, satisfying-esque I told you so-like tone, followed by one of my buddies being upset and complaining about the announcement, but only because whoever announced it, and I think it was Adam Alexander, said Casey Atwood's name by mistake, to which we all laughed. That's literally what happened in terms of that. Remember when I asked if this story had stuck with me because I felt partially responsible for what happened to Kevin for some reason, though I know I'm not? Well, that's why. What if fans like us were too naive to the situation and made the assumption that he was a druggie without considering anything else as a possibility? Mental health is still a topic that isn't getting the attention it should. So just imagine how bad it was in the mid-2000s. Yeah, we didn't know, but our negative assumptions may have made things worse. I wonder if Kevin ever looked up the responses to those stories involving him. Did he ever see those who negatively responded to him saying he was trash or a junkie or a druggie? If so, how much psychological damage did that do to him and his mental state? I was among that crowd. No, not on a forum. I didn't even have internet back in the day to do stuff like that. But I also had thought that guys doing drugs in NASCAR were druggies and they were bad. It turns out, instead, that some of them were suffering from other things and trying to relieve or escape from their pain or illnesses and disorders they were dealing with. And I fear the negative things we said may have made it worse for Kevin. After Kevin's death and learning about the concussion situation from 2006, I decided to make an amendment to the Drug Boy rule. The amendment, cleverly named the Kevin Grubb rule, states that if a driver is suspended for the drug policy, we search the truth before making a declaration for or against said driver via the Drug Boy rule. Funny enough, the Drug Boy rule no longer exists. It was abolished after we learned the truth about Shane Meal. We didn't know that Grubb or Shane Meal were battling mental health issues when they were suspended. In September of 2010, I found an article about Shane Meal that came out in August of 2010, where there were talks about him perhaps going to IndyCar. This was before that now infamous Terre Haute crash from October 2010 that ended his racing career, by the way. It was with that article I discovered that Shane Meal has bipolar disorder. And it turns out he was self-medicating in response to the fact that he was misdiagnosed with ADHD at the age of 5. 5! Oh, and here's the best part. I found said article during a Kevin Grubb search. Kevin was brought up towards the end of the article. It was after reading that article that we all agreed that we were wrong on Meal and especially Grubb. We basically disbanded the Drug Boy rule and made the Kevin Grubb rule the rule in terms of those type of situations. Also, we disbanded the Drug Boy nickname from Shane Meal. We no longer call him that. Only Kevin's friends and family would truly know about the last 2.5 years of his life, let alone his entire 31-year existence on the earth. And the only things the rest of us would know would be from articles of the past. The people on the internet who claim they knew or met Kevin always seem to say the same things. He had a great sense of humor, he was passionate about racing, he was always friendly, kind, sweet, and caring. He always looked and seemed happy. And he had a very nice and memorable smile. That was the most common comment among the people who say they knew or met Kevin, that they remember his smile. That comment reminds me of a post from one of the first websites I had captured in relation to my searches. And based on the responses and similar stories of other people dying this way, I agree. I imagine that Kevin knew too well how to mask his demons with that smile. What's more heartbreaking and unusual than anything is that usually when sad news like this with a former driver happens, NASCAR would usually acknowledge it, usually during the pre-race ceremonies and stuff. They didn't when it happened to him the next weekend at Darlington. In addition, the only car I'm aware of that had a memorial decal of any sort was Jason Keller's number 27 car in the Nationwide Series owned by Baker Curb Racing, which used to be Bruco Motorsports. Interestingly enough, Wayne Grubb was a part of that team at that time. If there were other cars that had a tribute to Kevin, I'm not aware of it. Though I'd assume Casey Atwood's car probably had something. During the Cup event, the Fox crew didn't mention it whatsoever. Now, granted, you could say that the Jeremy Mayfield news was why, but even then, that was mentioned by the Fox crew for like 20 seconds, and that was it. As for the Busch, now at that point Nationwide Series event, the race itself is on YouTube, but the NASCAR Countdown pre-race show before it is not. For some reason, my memories recall Alan Bestwick mentioning Kevin's death during NASCAR Countdown before the 2009 Diamond Hill Plywood 200, back when the Nationwide Series was exclusively on ESPN. And it sounded like he wasn't aware of the story. He sounded like he usually does, and I specifically remember Alan sounding normal, even stating that Kevin committed suicide. I was surprised at Bestwick's tone when he said those words, let alone the fact he said those words. After that was when he started to sound somber about the story. I questioned why Bestwick said it the way he said it at that time. I guess that specific questioning is why I remember it that way. The only thing I could come up with is that Bestwick didn't know the story ahead of time and thought he was announcing that Grubb was being reinstated and not what he read that night. It's like NASCAR wanted this story totally ignored other than the day the story was released. And there are some people out there who do think that. That's just lame in my book. I feel like NASCAR badly owes Kevin and his family. Not just because for what they did to him in 2006, but because I feel like what they did in 2006 at his home track of Richmond is the main reason Kevin succumbed to his depression. Maybe NASCAR knows that and wants to ignore it. But they can't. To me, it was only just the start. One thing I do wish had happened though, and I still do now, is that NASCAR would have gotten a wake-up call from this event and made an effort to try and help those suffering through issues like this. We hear about the sport for drivers and crew members going through physical injuries and stuff, especially when they're currently in the sport. Once they're out of the sport, good luck. It's even worse when you're going through mental health issues. NASCAR seemingly chooses not to care about those issues at all. It's interesting, though. Something else in a completely different sport occurred a little over a year later, made that sport change how they deal with things like this completely. I don't expect you to know anything about this story. It's about rugby. You may have heard of the story of the first guy in history to be suspended for testing positive for HGH. It was worldwide news. It was spread everywhere, even to countries that knew nothing about rugby. I found out about said news on ESPN in February of 2010. Well, 7 months later, in September, that same rugby player, named Terry Newton, died by suicide. The news of his death was also worldwide news, and once again I found out said news from ESPN. It was later discovered that Terry also suffered from depression. I guess it was because of Kevin Grubb's story, but I searched this story as well. There were more reasons Terry succumbed to depression besides that ban. He lost his sister the year before to pneumonia after her own battle against drug addiction and stuff, and was going through a separation with his wife after said ban. Remember when I said that toxicology results are usually not revealed when they reveal nothing? This wasn't one of them. It turns out Terry tried to cope through other methods before his death. Any one of them which could have worsened his mood to have it get to that point. It was because of that story that the Rugby Football League started a mental health awareness charity called State of Mind. And it's helped many others. Both regular people and rugby players alike deal with their mental health issues and pain. But I wonder why NASCAR didn't respond the way Rugby League did. Even after Dick Trickle's death in 2013, NASCAR didn't do anything to respond to these kind of pains that happen to former drivers, whether physical or emotional or mental. It took one suicide for Rugby League to wake up and to do something to help others, including their own. I wish NASCAR had done the same thing the year before. My fearful question is, which former driver will have to die by suicide for NASCAR to actually, finally, do something to help drivers and crew members from all eras affected by head injuries and mental health illnesses? I'll hate it if it has to be the one driver whose actions always made NASCAR bend over backwards in terms of injury and safety policies when anything happens to him. Multiple times. I know I sound bad and morbid saying it like that, but you know NASCAR is horrendous when it comes to being proactive towards anything, and this is not a one-time thing either. They'll only do something if it affects one of their guys, regardless of how many times it's happened to other drivers beforehand, or if they're forced into change due to massive criticism. In fact, NASCAR's so-called concussion policy has been changed 4 times since 2002 because of this driver, and this driver only. Which, obviously, by now you've probably figured out is Dale Earnhardt Jr. In fact, between the two major and most notable years where the concussion policy was changed, 2002 and 2012, I can name you off the top of my head 8 drivers who had a head injury during crashes in NASCAR races. including 2 with a traumatic brain injury. The other 6 had concussions, including 2 who are no longer with us. One of them being Kevin Grubb. I said it in the September 2010 Meal blog post journal entry to myself, and I'll say it again here. I am also hopeful that the NASCAR World Merrimates pays attention to this. Maybe they will learn that mental health issues may have something to do with their people in their sport, and should actually try to help them if there is a mental issue. They should have learned that after what happened to Kevin Grubb. Interesting how I said that initially in September of 2010. And I was 19 at that point, by the way. And we're learning more and more about these after effects of head injuries and other pains the drivers go through today after their careers are done, whether by choice or not. I said that in 2010. And all because of a 31-year-old race car driver from my home state was lost because of depression, and because we, for the most part, were naive to see the real problem and the truth, and called him out as a druggie and not what he truly was. A young man suffering through depression. A young man I feel like a lot of us, mostly and especially those experts in NASCAR, failed in multiple ways. Kevin got the help he needed to overcome and beat the drug abuse he had in the early 2000s due to him trying to self-medicate from the depression that was hurting him. But it appeared he never didn't or wasn't able to get the help he needed to deal with the depression itself. Years ago, I want to say this was back in 2011, when the Virginia Bazaar was still a big thing. There was a big area that sold sports stuff. I always went there and spent a lot of time there. I also went through the NASCAR stuff. On 2 occasions, after finally getting through one box full of interesting NASCAR items, I found a folder of those informative pictures that people get autographs on. And I found a Kevin Grubb one. And it was autographed too. After the second occasion, I ended up buying it for $3, I think. It was a flea market, so. Before going home, my dad asked me what I had bought, and I showed it to him. I don't remember his exact response, but I think it was something along the lines of, "Kevin Grubb? Wonder why you bought that?" Honestly, I didn't have an answer for him. Even if I had tried to explain it to him, he wouldn't get it no matter what I would have said. So I said nothing. Kevin's story has affected me a lot. His story made me more of a compassionate person than I could have ever imagined. Maybe over-compassionate in some cases, who knows. But you know what? I'd rather be over-compassionate than not compassionate at all. The stigma against mental health issues and suicide must go away. I had hoped that NASCAR would have helped with that after what happened in 2009, just like Rugby League the year after. But they didn't. And they really didn't after 2013 either. And now knowing about the head injuries and mental health connections and concerns, especially with former drivers, I hope that it won't take one of NASCAR's more popular guys dying this way for them to finally get the ball rolling on this subject. That wouldn't be good for anyone. Knowing NASCAR, though, I fear that will probably be the case, though. And it shouldn't be that way, nor would it be right. They should have learned after what happened to Kevin. I did. But like with that 2006 Richmond controversy and Kevin's concussion, NASCAR essentially discarded it. And they shouldn't have.
And that young man finished second today. Let's hear from him.
Well, a big smile on the face of Kevin Grubb. You told me when you teamed up with Bobby King and Jeff Buckner, you knew good things were going to come. A runner-up finished second place, best career finish. Congratulations.
I tell you, it's been coming all year. Bobby King, Jeff Buckner, Joe Cuffman, all the guys back at the shop, they work hard, and they've given me great race cars every race. We've been fast almost every race. We just had bad luck. It's been keeping us out of the win or in the top 5. So, you know, finally we had a good, clean race, and it went smooth the whole way. We just, you could say we ran out of laps, but, I mean, you don't never know what would have happened. Matt Kenseth had a great run. It was fun.
What did you learn? What was the biggest thing you learned today?
Mainly just, you know, when we had that long green, after about 20 laps, you know, you kind of had a feeling it was going to go a long ways. It normally does here in the middle of the race. It goes for a long time. So I was kind of laid back and set a steady pace. And it was a pretty fast pace, and just made it to that first pit stop. And that's when we made adjustment on the car and really got the car fast. And that was Bobby King's call, and he did a good job.
Well, he came home in second place, but it feels like a win today, Eli.
I've said this in the comments sector for videos pertaining to this subject, and I feel like in terms of you, it's what I desire most now, knowing what I have, and have attempted to figure out doing all these random searches for a long while whenever you get into my head for whatever reason. Regardless of which path of theories throughout these years regarding you makes up the truth in terms of your story. Kevin, I hope that you are at peace. This is the message that ended NASCAR Race Hub's White Knight movie about Dick Trickle, who also died by suicide close to 4 years to the day after Kevin Grubb did. This is also how I choose to end this video. People in these kinds of pain, whether it be physical like Trickle or mental like Grubb, can both lead to a hopelessness that, in their cases, led to the most tragic of conclusions to both of their lives. May, interestingly enough, is National Mental Health Awareness Month. And the stories of both Ray Combs and Kevin Grubb instilled in me a passion about caring for others and helping those suffering from these kinds of pains. If you're going through these kinds of pains and despair, please, just talk to us and let us help you. Talk with your friends and your loved ones. They'll be more than willing to help you any way they can. We know that a lot of times the pain may be unbearable, especially for an extended amount of time, and you don't want us to worry. But while we know that you so desperately want to get rid of these issues and pains that you are dealing with, regardless of whatever pains you are feeling, please also know that dying by suicide so your pain and despair finally goes away and we don't have to worry about you anymore is not the answer. Losing you does not help whatsoever. If anything, all it does is spread your pain to us. We know that despite the pain you're going through, deep down you don't want us in that kind of pain either. So please hang in there. We're here for you. Likewise, if you know someone who's going through a rough time, dealing with a lot of pain, whether physical, emotional, or mental, and they feel like there's no hope for them, be there for them. Do whatever you can for them. Let them know that there are people who are willing to talk, willing to listen, and willing to help them in any way, shape, or form. Hopefully this video opened your eyes to this subject and to this story. And I'm hopeful that this video can help end the stigma against mental health, pain, and misunderstanding, so that we never have to go through a story like this ever again. Do you hear me, NASCAR?